Now, thank you. Okay. Now, he's an interesting character, Jeff. You're gonna have to click it on the screen here.
Yeah, I gotta accept the recording.
Oh. He's not only our president of TCHA, he's our head AV guy. So, all right. Okay, so George Ade, he's a humorist who really didn't intend to be funny. Okay, he was raised a farm kid, but hated everything having to do with farming. He was a classic author, but somehow he wrote in the language of slang and was very popular. He supported the arts, the literature, and drama at Purdue, but he's got a football stadium named after him. And at the turn of the century, he was the talk of the town. At the turn of the 21st century, nobody really knew who he was. So we can say that George Ade is a bit of a modern day enigma. Now, everybody comes from somebody. George came from John Adeline Ade, and they were from Scotland originally. The Ade name is actually derived from the Scottish derivative of Adair. Now, George has a very interesting explanation for how he got from Adair to Ade. As he states it, it seems about 600 years ago, a lot of Adairs came down into England, probably to get some money. The name became variously twisted and abbreviated because no one, including the authors, knew how to spell. So what you see when you start researching Ade, you see all these variations like Ide, Ade, Adair, Ada. All because, according to George, they didn't know how to spell. Another family name that crops up is Hazelden, which is likely the source of where George got the name for his estate, Brook, Indiana, called Hazelden. We'll get to that in just a bit. So John Ade, George's father, John, was born just about 6 miles from the English Channel there in the town of Lewis. And he was the oldest of 5 boys. Family was Baptist inclination. And in 1840, an interesting thing happened. Taxes were levied on all the residents to rebuild the local castle for the Church of England. Now that's why I've underlined Baptist and Church of England. They did not fabulously get along at all. Therefore, John packed up his family with his wife and his children, hopped on a ship, and after 6 weeks of stormy weather across the Atlantic, they made it to New York City. And that's how George Ade, not quite here with us yet, actually made it into the Ades got to us. Now the family made it to Pittsburgh inland, and then they took a flatboat, floated down to Cincinnati, got off at Cincinnati, which of course is the jumping off point for many ancestors in our area here. And again, he moved up and settled in a little town called Chevoy. Excuse me, I mispronounced that. You notice I said Chevoy, that's French. This town was settled by the Scots. Therefore, it was Cheviot, or some variation therein, but it was not Chevoy. Okay, so again, it's Cheviot. Nice, good old Scottish accent. Now, John, being the oldest of the sons, went to school only for about 3 months, and then he had to get a job. So he got a job as a blacksmith, very useful trade, But at 19, he got the Western sickness, meaning he had the urge to go west. So John, George's future father, basically hopped on a float boat, traveled down the Ohio River down to Cairo. And when he got there, he said, which way to go, south or north? In this case, he decided to go north up to Galena, Illinois. Anybody know what Galena, Illinois is known for? Yeah, exactly. It was the largest lead mining area really in east of Mississippi. And so he got off there, kind of looked around a little bit, thought, I'm going to take a walk. I'm going to walk over to Chicago. What's going on over there? So he hikes it on foot over to Chicago. And here was his impression of Chicago. 1, the water mains are made out of hollow logs. 2, they haul the water, which stinks from the lake. And 3, it's nothing but a mud hole. Therefore, what did John Ade do? He headed back to Chicago. Okay, and there he met Adeline, beautiful young lady. They're both really, if you look at this picture, George mentioned this too, they're really like marquee items. They just had that look to them. Very, very wonderful looking people. They married when she was 18, he was 23. And as George said, the ancestry is all British. This is what I have always felt, that I had the right to take liberties with the English language. Now, 2 years later, John and Adeline, John specifically receives an offer to go to the frontier, western frontier. In this case, a pioneer outpost called Morocco, Indiana. which was at that time in Jasper County, Indiana. Now, the thing is, remember, Indiana was south of, and it really kind of petered out. Tippecanoe County was founded in 1826. All right. The other counties kind of came afterwards. Why? Because they couldn't figure out how to get across the wetlands, the swamps in northwest Indiana. So a lot of settling did not really occur in this area. This was truly an outpost. So John Adeline, her baby daughter, who was less than a year old, took a flatboat down to Madison, Indiana, caught a train up to Indianapolis, and then boarded the brand new Indianapolis Lafayette Railroad and made it up to Lafayette, the edge of civilization. Now, Ellsworth. Now, those of us who are familiar with Tippecanoe County, right? Ellsworth, very prominent land speculator. North River Road used to be Ellsworth Road, named after him until it was renamed River Road. His land company had actually placed a plank road about 12 miles north of town. Plank roads, again, were quite an innovation in the modern day ancient superhighway, because they were wooden planks put down so that the wagons would not make the ruts. 231 on here, where it goes south to Crawfordsville, that was all plank road at one time. Okay, so this plank road he had just put in, Ellsworth Company had just put in, so they had a good going north of Lafayette for about 12 miles, and then it was swamp thereafter, where they were basically cutting through swamp, trying to get around swamp and so forth. They made it through there, and they arrived in Morocco with all this dozen of widely spaced cabins, no roads, no buggies, no carriages. Good men and women of Morocco on good days would attend church, walking barefoot and put their shoes on when they got to the church. Okay? So that's kind of how it was. Now, interesting story is that Adelaide, when she came, she had a store-bought bonnet. Everybody looked at her a little skeptical. She came in all with her fancy bonnet, store-bought bonnet. But they were accepted into the community. John's store, turns out, was really a fur trading center, because it was really like cash crop they had there, that weeds. Okay, so there wasn't much really in the Morocco area to trade. But the government said, if you can establish a post office, you can get somebody to walk to Rensselaer at least once a week and pick up the mail, bring it back. So indeed, John became the first postmaster and made that trip every week up there. So he got mail delivery once a week. Civilization had arrived. But the postmasters had to be aligned with the political party in power. Now, remember how that got John's dad moving to the United States? Well, same thing kind of happened here. When John got his job, he was well aligned with the current Whig Republican, which was Millard Fillmore. But Franklin Pierce was a very strong Northern Democrat. And when he came in, he fired all the postmasters and anybody else who was not associated with the Whig Republican Party. So John was fired for offensive partisanship. He's now unemployed. Well, interesting thing happened about that time. In 1859, Indiana decided to notice the capitalized, re-establish Newton County. You mean Newton County had disappeared? Yes, it did. Newton County was actually established way back in 1835, originally, okay? But it looked very different. It was pretty much a 30-mile square county. It was actually situated in the northern part of what is now Jasper and Newton County. It was actually cut back a year later because apparently somebody figured that it was too big for its bridges at 30 miles on each side. So they cut it back in 36, and 3 years later, they completely wiped it out and absorbed it into Jasper County. It disappeared. So it took all the way until 1859 when somebody down in the assembly decided we need a county up there named Newton County. And so they reestablished it in 1859. And in so doing, as you know, whenever there's a new county, you have to have a county seat. And so they established the county seat at Kent, later called Kentland. And that is how we got the aides to them, because the postmaster, the recently fired postmaster Morocco, became the first recorder of Newton County, the new Newton County, which is proclaimed as the newest county in the state of Indiana. Now, I'll have to ask our experts from Newton County whether that's because of the second reestablishment of Newton County or the first establishment. Okay. So anyway, well, John Adeline built a nice residence in Kentland. It was the second residence to be built there. And George was born in this house in 1866. Now, he was the fifth of 6 children, and he was the baby boy. And perhaps what we know today about the baby of the family might explain some of the things about George as he was growing up. One of George's earliest recollections is as follows. I was sitting on a fence on an October night, 1871, looking at a blur of illumination in northern sky. Northern lights? Nope. It was Chicago, which was burning up in a highly successful manner. So you could actually see the glow all the way down in Morocco. Now, young George was often described as a daydreamer. Okay, they didn't really call him lazy. They just said he tended to kind of be thinking off on his own. He was once told to interrupt his incessant reading, quote unquote, to bring firewood into the kitchen. His mother wanted him to do that. So he dutifully went out, gathered up the wood, brought it back in, hauled it through the parlor, took it back to the living room, put it right next to the chair where he was reading, sat down, started reading again. A little while later, his mother comes in demanding to know where her wood is. And he was astonished to see that the wood had somehow appeared next to him in the chair. He knew he had taken it into the kitchen, but there it was. Oftentimes he forgot to turn out the cow in the morning. Okay, fortunately, he never forgot to bring it back in at night. But his mother actually had to warn him not to walk along the train tracks because she knew that if the wind was blowing in George's face, he would turn around and walk backwards on the tracks. And knowing George, he would never hear the train coming. So that little bit of advice probably saved his life early on. Now, there was no public library really in the Kentland area, so George would read any magazine, pamphlet, piece of paper that he could find. In fact, he was introduced to Dickens and Twain early on, and he just devoured them. It was said that if you went to a party, the host would hide the magazines. Otherwise, George would find the magazines, go into a corner, and simply ignore everybody else while he read the magazine. Okay, so they would hide the magazines. But George hated everything about farming. In fact, later on, he was quoted as saying, being on a farm the year round was a good deal like being in jail, except the prisoners in jail are not required to work 14 hours a day. So John Ade, his father, worried. What was going to become of a farm son in a farming community who detested farming and had no talent for anything else except daydreaming? Well, of course, the answer is you send him to a little agricultural college in Lafayette. Now, this was George's observation about Purdue. Purdue was more than 10 years old when I arrived. The classroom was nearly dry. Now, this is actually predates George a little bit. This is probably closer to about 79 or so. Okay, so a little bit earlier, it advanced a little bit beyond that. John, his dad, applied for a scholarship for Newton County for George. And in fact, he was the only one to apply for a scholarship for George to go to college. Well, he got accepted to college, but his mom insisted that he needed another year of seasoning on the farm. So he actually didn't go to college in 82, he went in 83. Got on the Big 4 railroad, made the big trip down to the big city of Lafayette, got off there. He was one of only 2 boys from the entire county going to the college, and George was the only one going to Purdue. And so John was a little bit fearing for the worst for George as he put him on that train and sent him off. George's view of it was, the masterminds of the 19th century were waiting to discover me, then crush me beneath the juggernaut of infinite superiority. The high school lambkin was headed for the jungle where the wild animals roam. That was George's impression of what he was going into. Now, his first impressions of Purdue, and this is more representative, this is 1882, and he arrived in 83. So again, there have been some upgrades to that. I don't think the upgrades are quite as depicted as they were here. This artist took quite good liberty with how good the fences were and everything, but anyway, you get the idea. But his first impressions of Purdue were regarding his concern about being able to get into this prestigious agricultural technical college. Well, there are 29, there are 30 people who got in, George and 29 others. And George said this about it. There was no possible chance of my not landing as a freshman. Any human being between the ages of 15 and 20 who ventured anywhere near Purdue's campus was roped and dragged into the registrar's office. President Smart and I arrived on the scene practically at the same time. That's true. President Smart had just come on campus at the time that George arrived. He came in a Phaeton. I came in Charlie Martin's expressway. That's a Phaeton right there. That's Queen Elizabeth riding in her Phaeton right there. George boarded at Ladies' Hall, which was not just for ladies. There weren't enough ladies to fill up Ladies' Hall, so pretty much anybody could do that. In fact, John T. McCutcheon's father was the commissary, ran Ladies' Hall for 2 years there. And John T. McCutcheon actually spent a year there as a young child while his dad was doing that. $250 a week, good deal. George described the building as a nondescript building of unnecessary scallops and unexpected and unoccupied turrets. How about that for a linguist, huh?
What's a scallop?
Yes, a scallop, curves.
Oh.
Okay, the strange things along the top, basically just a random curve stuck in there. Okay, on the food at Ladies' Hall. When the waitress asked you if you wanted fruit and you said you did, you got dried currants mixed in with a little bit of stem and some gravel. He put forward this theory. Any college boy who can establish a reputation of studiousness during his first year may be pleasantly surprised at how much he can get away with later on. He excelled in English, as you would expect, but he had night terrors when it came to math. And he shared that here with John McCutcheon, who also described mathematics as malignant mathematics. So George avoided all math courses and instead taking a German course, even at one point instead of a math course. Now, interestingly enough, George had this to say: I felt relieved that just prior to I entering college, Emerson E. White, author of the famous arithmetic textbook, had resigned as Purdue's president. Indeed, he had. When president came in, basically the new one, White had just left, literally about 2 days before. And it all really stemmed from politics within Purdue University. White really was against any fraternities being on campus, and he was overruled. That was kind of the last straw, and that's why he left. Okay. So anyway, George was talking about this distinguished Emerson E. White, and he said, I would have been uncomfortable sharing the same campus with the man whose book had tortured me so badly in my grammar school days. Now, George served, as you would expect, on the editorial board of the Purdue, which was the precursor to the Exponent. And this is a copy right here. It's not a copy, it's actually the original. With it. And if you look on the first page under editorial staff, it says George Ade, local editor. So what he was in charge of is finding all the gossip on campus and reporting it in the Purdue, kind of like the society pages of newspapers later on. He did that only for a year, but he continued to actually contribute essays to the publication. A little insight into George's writing style that would actually kind of is illustrated by this story. Now, George belonged to a literary society called the Irvings. And on campus, if you were anybody, you belonged to one of the three literary societies on Purdue's campus. And the literary societies fought each other. They just said bad things very eloquently about each other, okay? But they were literary societies. He was with the Irvings. They hated the Carlyles, couldn't stand it, bitter rivalry. But anyway, what they would do is they would share among the members as to somebody each month would be in charge of presenting the meeting or getting the meeting entertainment. And so when it came up for George's turn, he found an individual to write an essay to which that individual was going to then present his essay to the literary society. But the individual he had picked couldn't think of a topic. And he said, kept putting George off, said, I can do it, but I can't think of a topic. I can't think of a topic. I can't. The night before the meeting, there was no essay. So George threw something together on the fly, something that he just called, as he looked around his room and saw his books, then and now. And so he wrote this little essay. The gentleman who was supposed to present it, presented it. And interestingly enough, the newspapers, who always have a little obligation to write about this particular event, said it was pretty good, but they went on and on about the real hit of the evening was the essay, Books Then and Now, to the point that professors were requesting copies of this essay. Now, this is a little embarrassing because nobody knew that George wrote it. They thought that this freshman had actually written it, and wow, that was really outstanding. So finally, George told him, he said, look, don't tell anybody I wrote it. We'll just kind of look at it as a joke, just between you and me. Okay. So that nobody ever knew that really this was George that did it. But this gave George a little epiphany. It looks to me, if people like to hear something that sounds natural, the way a person would talk it off. Now that epiphany would open George to a world of fame and fortune. Now, George loved drama. He loved it even from a time when shows would come through Kentland and stop every once in a while. And he used any spare money he had to see the shows at the old Opry House. Now, we know that as the Dreyfus Theater or the Grand Opry House here in Lafayette. George would absorb everything. He paid his 25 cents to go sit up in the second balcony way up there, and he would observe everything, how the stage was cast, how players moved back and forth, how the dialogue went on, etc. His attention to the dramatic arts was so strong that his grades kind of sucked in the junior year, according to George, because the Grand Ole Opry had a succession of really good plays. As his biographer, Kelly, said, "Let no reader ever suppose that George Ade permitted his classwork to distract from his studies of drama. What he learned by drama by sheer observation would then come to play in George's later career." A special important in George's junior year was this: an interesting combination of personality types that were similar and yet very dissimilar. Beginning with a freshman named John T. McCutcheon. Now, John was he was a prep. And the prep in those days was somebody who came to the campus, but really wasn't prepared from the high school to enter college courses. And so they were kind of looked down on a little bit, okay, by the rest of the undergrads and the upperclassmen. So he didn't really meet him that first year. But the one thing about John is he noticed George. And this is what he noticed about him. He said he had an unusual face among the sophomores, a refined, clean-cut, delicately aquiline face. He stood out among the surrounding rugged, freckled, corn-fed features of his classmates, okay? Or the next year, they did get together, and actually George was the one who scouted John to become a member of Sigma Chi, the first fraternity on Purdue's campus. And Sigma Chi turned out a lot of notables, including Booth Tarkington, who was a good friend of both John and George. So John T. McCutcheon, later as we know, he was the Dean of American Pulitzer, a political cartoonist, began doing illustrations in various publications, and he drew this caricature of George here. Now, his drawings, he said about George had three outstanding characteristics that invited caricature: an unusual expanse of head behind the ears, a sweep of strongly marked eyebrows, and a striking lack of abdominal fullness, meaning he was not fat. So those are the things that John noticed about him in the crowd with that. And if you look at some of the pictures we'll see of George, you notice he always wore his bowler hat a little bit propped on the back of his head because he had so much expanse behind his ears. Now, George didn't know it, but this friendship with John would open a path for George to flourish as a writer. In George's final year of Purdue, he enjoyed it immensely. He was president of Sigma Chi. He led the Irvings. He tried to crush the Carlyles unsuccessfully, but he also became attentive to a young lady who was a freshman, and this was Lillian Howard. Now, Lillian Howard was a freshman. She belonged to a very proper family, okay? In fact, so proper that George oftentimes had conversations with her mother when he came to court. And she would talk to George about his less than ideal interest in the church, and talk and talk and talk. Eventually, the lectures wore George down and he stopped coming around very much, including after he graduated. So Lillian was then courted in turn by a handsome Baptist minister that we can only assume that Mom approved of, and afterward they were married. George's biographer, Kelly, Fred Kelly, in his book, talks about this and kind of makes a bold statement. He says that, oh, that was good. Yeah. Lillian Howard was the one girl with whom George Ade would ever be in love. It's interesting. He never did marry. All right. So in 87, all good things have to come to an end. George Ade and 7 other graduates became alumni of Purdue University. Big class there. Okay. As George said, I went to Purdue. I graduated in 87, and then my troubles began. With no plans, George returned to Kentland, where the hometown folks all shook their heads and go, yep, we predicted George would go there 4 years to Purdue and not learn a damn thing was worth anything. The neighbors felt sorry for his father, John, told him so. But one night at dinner, George announced that he had a law firm in Lafayette offer him a job. Now, the folks could say, he's going to be a lawyer. He's going to study law. And they could answer that nagging question that everybody asked him, what is going to become of George? So that's what George did. Packed his bags, went back to Lafayette, mostly because then he could catch the shows of the Grand Ole Opry. And yeah, he was going to study the law. He stuck with it for all of 7 weeks before he decided the law was not for him and he quit. But he was picked up by an innovative individual who was starting a newspaper, a brand new newspaper called the Morning News. It's a Republican-backed paper, and it was designed to be a lead up to the elections coming up, so they could tout the Republican candidates. And George was promised a princely sum of $8 a week, which to him was an incredible amount of money. However, it was never paid. He was promoted to assistant city editor, but they never quite got a payment because they never sold enough newspapers to really get any money to pay their staff. But they kept promising. Finally, as the next payroll loomed, the editor-in-chief disappeared, the chief writer fled to Delphi, and the city editor relocated to Crawfordsville. George and the composing room foreman, the only two people left, basically put a last issue out, and then, quote, "We held a brief funeral service, pooled our finances, and then went to an all-night funeral." So was the end of the Lafayette Morning News. But George, luck as his habit, picked up a offer from the Lafayette Call for $6 a week. Now, this is a cut and pay, right? But the difference was they actually did pay him $6 a week. And he began to collaborate with an interesting individual, George Barr McCutcheon, who was on the rival paper. Now, George Barr McCutcheon was not only John T. McCutcheon's older brother, but he also was quite an author himself later on in his years, putting out the Grustark series of books that were very popular. Of course, Brewster's Millions, that was put into 3 different movies. At this point, while I was on the call, George was recruited by Harry L. Kramer, which is a whole nother story in itself. Harry L. Kramer was your basic snake oil salesman, but he was very successful at it. He developed patent medicines, but he also developed, in conjunction with this spa, Mud Labia. Mud Labia was this beautiful spa for which people would come to from hundreds of miles around to be cured or to spend time there, the relaxing thing in Kramer, Indiana. And Kramer, Indiana still exists. In fact, the foundation of this building still exists up there. It's between 55 and 41, just west of Etiquette. But according to George, hunger and the approach of cold weather drove him from the call for Kramer's offer of $12 a week, a small fortune in that day. George's job was to write advertisements for cascarettes and no tobacco products that were the product of the Kramer company. I'll pass these around. Remember the day of castor oil? Castor oil cured everything. Castor oil is what we would call in the medical field an irritant laxative. It basically stimulates the hell out of your guts, and that's how it produces effects. These cascarettes were candy, and they had a much milder effect, and so they were very, very popular. And so George's job was to sell these things and to actually drum up business for that. And he did it very well. He actually came up with he's credited with coining the famous name cascarettes, and your grandparents, if they were anywhere in the Midwest or even on the East Coast, they knew this product because it was so highly touted. George coined the famous name and also the popular slogan, "They work while you sleep." Okay, and so George made Kramer tons of money with his advertising while he was being paid $12 a week. Okay, fair deal. But he actually pulled in John T. McCutcheon into this thing, thinking, "I like to share the wealth." Now, John was still produced it, but John did the original painting of the no tobacco type poster, which was very popular. The picture was John McCutcheon's first published cartoon. And the likeness of this, basically the no tobacco Spartan standing over the defeated nicotine warrior, went on to be on all these products with that. Now, John never got any royalties from it, of course, but this was his ability to do that while he was still a student. Now, the thing was, George wrote the copy, including the word guarantee. And he was able to stand by. He and Kramer were able to stand by this guarantee for the very simple reason that here's the back of one of those tins and the directions and suggestions, of which the first line is immediately discontinue the use of tobacco. If you follow the directions, we would get you off of tobacco. All the miracles of no tobacco. Well, between nights of working and so forth, George spent time with the Sigma Chi boys, his fraternity. And one night he suggested that they put out a publication in anticipation of the 15th commencement of Purdue University. And so what they did is George actually arranged for advertising, financing. He wrote most of the prose, and he wrote John McCutcheon into helping draw illustrations. John actually got a couple of cartoonists from Chicago to help in. And what they produced was a product here called the souvenir. Now, Kevin asked me a good question. He said, is this the debris? No, this is not the debris. This was not published as the debris yearbook. The first yearbook was 1889. It wasn't 1990 or 1890 debris. But this was separate from it, produced by the Sigma Chi chapter, the Delta chapter of Sigma Chi. And so it was really quite a publication. But the interesting thing about it is there was a poem in here called The College Widow. For those of you that know George Ade, this will come back in his future also. So shortly after the souvenir came out, guess what happened? Kramer sold out his company to I can't remember the name of it, but basically it was another company, and George was out of a job again. This time, the Kentland folks for sure thought he was coming back home to farm. Meanwhile, John McCutcheon was up in Chicago, basically sent George a message or a letter and said, why don't you come up to Chicago? You can share my flat, you can find a job up here. So he was unemployed and decided to take John up on his offer. Well, John introduced George to the city editor of the Morning News. Okay, one of the popular, and George was hired to write about the weather for $12 a week. That's a princely sum for writing about the weather. It's going to rain. It's going to be okay. But George would not let it go at that. No. George went out and interviewed people about what they thought about the weather, what impact it's having on their life. He would go up to the clerk at the hotel and say, how's the weather affecting the people when they check in? He'd go up to the caddies and say, how are your horses holding up in the weather? And he would incorporate that into the weather forecast. Well, it was extremely popular. In fact, it was so popular that the editor, after his first weather report, put it on the first page of the newspaper. George kind of had a knack for twisting things around and making it something. So he stayed on, so he earned his way to stay on the paper writing about the weather. In 1890, July 1890, an interesting thing happened. George got a break. Still doing the weather, still getting good accolades, still getting $12 a week. Not bad life. But at 7 o'clock one evening, when everybody else had left, it was out at dinner, call came in, there was an explosion on the Chicago River. This is a boiler explosion of the freighter Tioga. The Chicago River killed 15 people immediately, did a lot of damage in the area. This is a big story. And so George rushed down the river, and he had the good common sense to phone the editor and say, it's too big a story for one reporter. That's something the editor always appreciated in George, was that he knew it was too big. So the editor sent 3 other reporters down to the river, but he told them, you give your information to George. Let George write the story. Remember, George had been doing weather up to that. George wrote the story. The next morning, it made column 1 front page. It was picked up by other U.S. newspapers. George Ade had just become a star reporter for the Morning News, and he got a raise of $15 a week. Within a year and a half, 1892, George was not only a star, he was the star reporter in the Chicago Record. He changed his name from Morning News to Chicago Record in 1892. Now, part of the reason being is that George and a friend of his, who was on the Herald, always wrote these interesting articles for their papers about these explorers and adventurers who were passing through Chicago. And he may have been a guy who had just come back from India, where he just shot a Bengal tiger, or somebody who just got done exploring the darks of Africa and talking all about this. Well, the trip, their competition, couldn't figure out how this was being done. So they sent their best reporter to scour and scoop George and this Herald reporter. But the guy failed and was exhausted in the process, even though he was berated by his editors. Why? Well, because George and the Herald reporter had basically made all this up. They had conspired to create these explorers and adventurers who all conveniently left on the afternoon train for New York, but they left their signature in the book, the register book for the hotel, because the hotel clerk was conspiring with them. So that's how they got these really cool stories that everybody read. So in the fall of 1892, heard of John Sullivan? Okay. The upcoming fight between the champion John Sullivan and gentleman James Corbett was going to be held in New Orleans. Everybody was talking about this. Now, this was before social media, obviously, even fast news and so forth, but everybody knew about this. So the Record sent their best reporter, George, to interview the fighters. Now, George was ringside, and he knew if he got his story onto the wire before everybody else and scooped him, especially if Sullivan lost, he could make national news. So what he did, he sat ringside, and George was very good at vividly writing. He wrote everything shorthand, basically by hand. And when Sullivan hit the mat for the last time, George rushed to the telegraph station there in the arena and noticed that all the telegraphers were gone because they were all watching the fight. So he did the best thing that he could do. He ran out into the street, hailed a cab, and said, "I'm not going to take you anywhere." George gave him $2, said, "I'm going to climb on top of the roof." And he rode the roof of the cab downtown to the main office, got his story sent in on the wire. George's front page story was picked up, spread around with other newspapers that used it, and the edition readership of the Record soared. The editor recognized that. George had scored a scoop. So his writing style was kind of this, because we kind of said that George, writing about the weather, he could make it sound differently than anybody else. He said, "I wanted to be known as a realist with a compact style, a clean Anglo-Saxon vocabulary, the courage," this is important, "the courage to observe human frailties they showed on the lens, to depict people as they actually are. He aimed to report people as he knew them. He did not caricature," he left that up to John T. McCutcheon. "He did not exaggerate. He did not embroider fancy situations just to make the story better. He saw what he saw. He wrote of their lives through the medium of their own characteristic way of talking, something that was not done. His ear became infallible, catching the talk of the town and translating it into his stories." When they were socializing, the two bachelors about town did have a good time. Okay, they were out partying, as they should be. Now there's George. You can draw your own conclusion, but he just looks a little out of place to me for some reason. Okay, doesn't look like he's real comfortable, perhaps. And here's John in the front row having a good time. So the two of them were out and about town. But the thing is, the connections they made in those early years were people who would become politicians, leaders, legislators, actors, actresses, and others who basically would network for the rest of their lives, a network that they used for the rest of their lives to advance their career and their causes. They still shared, even though they were both successful, this hallway bathroom. Literally, it was a hallway that was turned into an apartment, a room. Okay, it had no bath, had no closet. Okay, but it was only $250 a week for each of them. But the thing was, their collective observation and writings, when they combined the pictures or illustrations of McCutcheon with Ade, produced a story that would put people in the scene when they read it. So they were given two columns to actually write about the Columbia Exposition, the biggest event in Chicago in 10 years. Their work provided the best documentation of people and their reaction to the exposition. They didn't write about how big the Ferris wheel was. They wrote about people's reaction to the things that they experienced going to the fair. And by doing that, the readers could project themselves into their writing. After the exposition closed, the editors decided to give exclusive control to two columns. This is unheard of. Exclusive control means the copy editors cannot touch your copy. And prior to this, George would write this beautiful thing. The copywriters would go down there and say, "We need more room for the labor strike." And they look at George's stuff and goes, "He's talking about some guy with a horse." And they cut it all out. This allowed George and John to have two columns exclusively there, and nobody could touch it. Hands off. And it was from this, the freedom that came with that, the stories of the street and town all came out. Now, George and John captured the sights, smells, and the lingo and jargon of making the reader feel they were actually in the scene. Very popular with their readers. And they were compiled later on into a book. But the Record, before they actually did the book, actually had a series of pamphlets they put out, and they recouped a lot of money off of this by just republishing the series from that, which they said was commonly conceived to be the best things of their kind printed. Okay, not that they're tooting their own horn or anything, but here's an interesting thing. As a result of their fame, the boys were invited to a meeting out in San Francisco, and it was all expense paid, and they got the exclusive use of Mr. Pullman's private Pullman car. And that's how they traveled across the country to San Francisco. Now, of course, it's a long trip. So what did George do? He put on a play and invited all the other people from the other cars to come up to their car and actually see the play. So this was George's first shot at a production of a play. The thing was that this trip whetted the boys' appetite for travel because they were from Indiana. They hadn't been any farther than Chicago, and that was the big city. Okay, but this now whetted their appetite for travel. So in 1895, the boys decided if we save up enough money, we can save up about $520 a piece, and we can spend several weeks in Europe traveling around the world. So the boys offered to resign from the record in order to take the trip. But the editor, being as savvy as he was, basically said if they submit 2 articles with illustrations each week, their salaries and positions would continue at the record. Such a deal. Okay, so off they went. Now, the stories of the street would be turned over to other people, but what George would write, this new column, would be what a man sees who goes far away from home. Now, like with the stories of the street, the record put these out as pamphlets afterwards, and then George actually turned it into a book called In Pastures New a few years later. So after returning from Europe, having a new perspective and new energy, George delved into writing columns about the life of specific individuals. So instead of just a random cabbie here, a random person collecting garbage here, you now have characters they picked up and you follow the series. In 1896, the readers of the record were introduced to a man called Ade. And Ade is a story about, quote, a young man of sound morality, decent manners, and little flashes of wisdom. Okay, and the drawings were done by McCutcheon. Ade spoke the slang of the street. This was different than what any other paper was doing. Say, I like that church, and if they put in a punching bag and a plunge, they can have my game. I'll tell you those. The slang of Ade. People had not seen that, or if they had, they'd heard it, and so they were intrigued by this. So the Ade series was so popular that Johnson and Company, who introduced Orson Welles and Bernard Shaw to the United States, produced Ade, a little pocket book, and it flew off the shelves. It flew off the shelves. The Ade series was followed by Doc Horn's series. Now, Doc Horn is a different character. He was a gentlemanly liar, and his satellites lived at the Alfalfa European Hotel. Now, here's a quote, said Doc, if they built the Mississippi levees as I told them to long before the war, they wouldn't be washed away every year. You knew in a phrase what Doc was all about, right? So at the end of 1896, George did something also a little bit radical. He introduced a black character. Essentially, he used a boot black in a barber shop where he frequented, using the same heavily accented language that was used. Of course, he and every other reporter knew that if you wanted to know what was going on in town, you always went to the barber shop because that's where you would hear everything. And so he took his experiences with that, and out of that came a book called Pink Marsh. Now, Pink Marsh and Doc Horn were all were really good sellers with that. So in the same period of time in 96, George's publishing career took off. Earlier in 96, he had been asked by another publisher to write 6 little books, literally little books, that were going to sell for about $1 a piece. And so in the span of a couple of weeks, George Ade and John McCutcheon collaborated together to produce a series of these books that he called Little Stories of Our Country. Now, the thing was, I'm going to pass this around so you can look at it a little closer up, but it's the same one as you see the photographs here, is the publisher didn't want to have the same author for all 6 books. So in the first book, the author is listed as John Hazelden, an adaptation from George's Hazelden family back name and George's first attempt at ghostwriting. So these were very, very popular. He also spent a week writing Circus Day. And Circus Day was a book that John illustrated for the same company. This is an older version of it, but the original version of it that I went to ABE website, Brook's website, $500 what they're asking for. So if you happen to see one of these things at a garage sale for $5, you might consider picking it up. Okay. All right. Well, in 1897, John and George kind of went their separate ways for a while. At least their careers did. And so they were offered the opportunity, along with a reporter from the Herald, to go on a round the trip on the USS McCulloch. Now that means nothing to us, except that as in Forrest Gump, it puts John T. McCutcheon in a position where he experiences history the first time, even though he was trying his damnedest not to. Okay. What happened is that George declined. He said, there's too many days at sea and too few ports to interest me, so I'm going to stay here in Chicago. So John went. So the trip allowed John and the Herald reporter to witness firsthand the onset of the Spanish-American War from Manila Harbor in the Philippines, when the American troops first fired on the Spanish. In fact, they were the only two non-military people to hear Dewey give his famous command, "You may fire when ready, Ridley." Of course, there were also only two people to hear it, who also about 15 minutes later, after the smoke had obscured the targets, the famous order by Dewey was said, "You may retire from breakfast, Ridley." So John became a war correspondent, stayed over there in Asia and set up a cable network of correspondence through that area, and allowed him to actually experience a lot of the natives. And he kept writing the articles for that, and the recorder kept paying him, except for, as it says here, bubonic plague cut him off from any money for about 2 weeks, and he had to scrounge for that. But as part of his coverage in America, Army events in the Philippines, he engaged with a, if you will, an entrepreneurial leader of one of the tribes. I put down here greedy and corrupt, and that's probably accurate, who was working an arrangement with the US Army to try to maintain his power and the money. He had been paid by the Spanish to actually keep his tribe quiet. Now he wanted the same arrangement with the Americans. So he was cuddling up to the Americans with that. John had the opportunity to interview and work with this guy several times with that. And he published a series of stories called The Sultan of Sulu. Now, John was so roused, he got such good responses from that George thought this would make a great operetta. Sure, okay. And this is the basis for George's first operetta, which was The Sultan of Sulu. So one day in 1897, while John's still gallivanting around Asia, George is back in Chicago. He's looking at a blank piece of paper going, I got to do something different. I'm bored, okay? Why not do a fable for a change? So I learned from writing that all people, especially women, are fond of parlor slang. So in cold blood, I began writing fables to make my columns go, but had no idea those fantastic things would catch on the way they did. September 17th, 1997, the first fable appeared in the record called The Fable of Sister May, Who Did As Well As Could Be Expected. Column did well, but George felt apparently really guilty about what he did to the English language, and he really didn't write another fable for about another year. But he put a warning on the next one he wrote, which is called, This is going to be the fable in slang. So the people would know that he wasn't really that inarticulate in writing. He intended for it to sound the way it did. The column was a hit. So every Saturday, George wrote a column to fable in slang with illustrations by George McCutcheon. And he used a combination, interesting, that he didn't use street slang in the worst way. He didn't allow any crudities at all. He used acceptable words. And he did a weird thing with the punctuation. He capitalized random words. So here's an example. Luella was a good girl, but her features did not know the value of teamwork. Sister May, she was different. She was short on intellect, but long on shape. Her date book had to be kept on the double entry system. So again, slang, okay, and lingo. In 1990, these were so popular, George was approached by the East Coast publisher to actually syndicate his fables in slang to 100 or more newspapers nationwide. Also in 1900, his first of a series of books came out, The Fables in Slang, which again were very, very popular. Fables in slang, more fables in slang, okay? So this meant George had a big decision to make because now we're talking serious cashing, okay? He was making a maximum salary at the record of about $65 a week. That's about $23.50 a day. He was making in today's dollars over $100,000 at that time. But the East Coast syndication offered that the record, for example, his paper would have to pay $65 per week for one table. And this was going to be run in hundreds of newspapers, each paying their individual syndication. George was making some money. So thus, in 1900, he said, I quit from the record, and his career as an active reporter ended. He now turned his efforts to writing musical plays, and he hired Alfred E. Walthall to write the music for his first comedic opera, which was the Sultan of Sulu. By the way, if you come up here, this is a picture of George dressed up as the Sultan of Sulu. Okay, it's kind of interesting. There are a couple ones over here, but again, type of things with this was very, very popular. Sultan of Sulu opened in the Studebaker Theater in Chicago, which was Chicago's biggest theater. And then it went to Broadway in December, the first of many of George's plays that would land on Broadway. In 1903, he did Peggy in Paris, also went to Broadway. In the same year, the County Chairman debuted on Broadway. So he had 3 plays at one time running on Broadway in the same year. By 1903, therefore, George was a syndicated columnist, had successful books, 3 plays on Broadway, okay? But he was still living in Chicago, and he was sending royalty checks, of which there were many, back home to his brother, who was buying up land. And with that land, he built an Elizabethan type estate that he called Hazelden. In 1904, at the ripe old age of 38, he retired to the life of a country squire.
The building's still there.
Yes.
Yeah, it is. It is, yes. Here's some photographs of Hazelden. Nice place. Okay, there's George lounging by his concrete swimming pool. The clubhouse. Okay, he built a country club back behind it.
Golf course there too.
Yep, absolutely. And dancing pavilion. You notice again the piano in the corner with the player rolls for the piano. Okay, and this is his private quarters. That's his office on the right. That's what it looks like today, what it looked like back then. So just 3 weeks after he moved to Hazelden in the life of a country squire, he completed the play, The College Widow, which was part of that poem that he wrote for the Souvenir. It ran for 278 performances on Broadway till 1905. And then, after it closed there, it ran nationwide with 3 different touring companies for a number of years. In fact, it went on for so long that in 2011, Ty Cobb, the sports player, the baseball player, starred in the 1911 version of The College Widow. Okay, George is said to have made in excess of $2 million by the end of that play, and that was that dollars back then. So 3 weeks after The College Widow opened, George Ade's Shogun opened also on Broadway. It was a Gilbert Sullivan style comedy, wildly successful, and more plays followed in rapid succession from 1906 to 1908. He'd written a lighthearted musical for the Purdue Harlequin Club, not really intending for it to be anything but a little college play. But a Chicago manager talked him into taking it to Broadway, New York, and it opened at Broadway and was very successful. Same manager convinced George to write another play for 2 of his actors. In 1910, Old Town opened, ran for 171 performances again on Broadway. So Old Town marked the end of George's lucrative and short career as a playwright of only 10 years, in which he produced 12 plays, 9 of which were successful. And so he retired again, now at the riper old age of 44. Okay, well, George got further royalties from his plays being converted into movies, like MGM produced The Fair Coed in 1927. In 1935, a little bit later in George's career, Will Rogers started the movie adaptation of The County Chairman. Now, notice the poster here, okay? Will Rogers was a bigger name than George by this time. So there's George's building right there, okay, with Will Rogers at the top. Interesting enough, this is one of Will Rogers' last movies, because it was a year later that he was killed in a plane wreck that he and Wiley Post, a very famous aviator, took in Alaska. So this is one of Will Rogers' last movies. As a county squire, George had time to dabble in other things at his leisure. So in 1912, he donated and raised funds for building the Sigma Chi house on Littleton, which is still there today. There's George with a shovel in hand. These people do not look particularly happy. It looks cold. Okay. He also devoted time and dollars to Sigma Chi at the national meetings. So in this case is a meeting where John T. McCutcheon was actually retiring from the Tribune, and George is giving accolades for him. But things were not always rosy with Purdue, okay? Particularly with Dr. Stone, he was president. After a visit in 1917 to the campus to work on some things there, this letter kind of gives George insight into how he felt. He didn't mince words. I felt disgusted with Dr. Stone and most faculty because of the lack of any spirit or enthusiasm among the students. After devoting many weeks of hard work and considerable sum of money put on the annual show, he's done the 1916 Harlequin show, it did not seem to me that students were grateful or even interested. Man's reward when he tackles a college job is the knowledge that the boys are with him. So I've been off Purdue ever since. As for Doc Stone, I wish him everything he wishes me, and I could not say anything rougher than that. George was not happy. Okay. Now, of course, you know, Stone died in 1921 from a mountaineering accident. Fell off a mountain, died. So after that, actually, George got a little more interested in what Purdue was doing, kind of made a rebound and reestablished some connections with Purdue at that time. Meanwhile, while all this was going on, Hazelden was turning into be a great place, center for annual picnics, stopovers, movie stars. Everybody would come by and say, not exactly that Brook, Indiana is on the main line between A and B of any place that I can find, okay? But they made their way to Brook, Indiana to stop and say hi to George. George regretted never having had enough ice cream as a child. Therefore, he started holding picnics once a year, or more than once a year, where he invited the local children, their families to come over, and they would have fireworks and ice cream and so forth. It started off maybe with 80 people, but after a couple of years of doing this, people were bringing their parents and relatives from out of town and sometimes out of state to this, so the numbers went into the hundreds. George was a very affable host. He would come out and he would welcome all, he would meet them up, and he insisted that he be called George, never Mr. Ade. The local newspaper summed it up. He said, "It's nice to have the facilities to stage such an affair. It's still more wonderful to have the disposition to do so." George wasn't terribly political, although he let people know what his politics were, okay? But Taft launched his campaign in the Midwest from Hazelden itself. With that, this is when he was Judge Taft, not President Taft. George Ade was friends with Teddy Roosevelt. They met at a Gridiron Club meeting and hit it off. But he didn't care much for FDR. In fact, he really didn't like FDR. But he didn't know that FDR actually read some of his fables of slang to those of when he conferred with it. Kind of like what Abe Lincoln used to do when he would read to his cabinet members. FDR did the same thing, but in this case, he was using fables and slang. So although George knew a lot of people, he really did not know David Ross. Now, Judge Henry Vitt, those in Tippecanoe County know the Vitt name, he's a Supreme Court judge, okay? He was also a classmate of George Ade and a fellow Sig, okay? He arranged for Ross and Ade to actually meet. Well, David took him out north of campus, showed him this big hole in the ground. There was a natural glacier scoop that basically had been dug out, a drift. And George Ade looks at it and goes, "How does this concern me?" And David politely says, "Well, here's where we're going to put our Purdue recreational field and stadium." And when I explained to George that I have an option that we can get 65 acres for a little under 40,000. All we have to do is buy it before the owner knows he has a stadium on his premises. I've been wondering if you'd be willing to help me finance the thing. Now, George had tried to do things on his own, try to get things going, and he complained that he rarely had people following him. So in this case, he was happy to follow somebody else. They turned to David Ross, who said, "I'll be glad to go along with you." The two of them split the cost of equally buying the land, which was no mean feat. It was very difficult. Ade said, "It's a fine way for two old bachelors to pay our fines to society." Now, interestingly enough, the Shook Agency, yes, that same Shook Agency we have here, with Father R.H., who originated it, son Charlie, land was eventually acquired through an incredible series of swaps and trades that gave rise to Hillsdale's neighborhood, as well as the Ross Ade Stadium. I mean, it was tremendous as to the swaps, the trade, and so forth that went on behind. It's just mind blowing with that, but they got it done. When the name Ross Ade was suggested, George said, "I was worried that Ross Ade might sound too much like a new name of a drink." Now, George, though, switched over to it and said, "Students who come here in a few years will know nothing about a fellow named Ade who wrote fables in slang. But if my name is on the stadium, they'll be tipped off that someone named Ade was identified with Purdue in some way." And that is the rumor as to why he actually went along with this idea of naming it Ross Ade Stadium instead of the Purdue Bowl. So November 22nd, 1924, the first game was played in Ross Ade. It was homecoming. It was Purdue versus IU, and Purdue won. George stayed active through the 30s and early 40s with that, but he slowed down quite a bit. As he got to the 40s, his health kind of deteriorated. But George was described as among the most vociferous alumni of Purdue University by those that had to deal with George. They always knew where he stood, and if they didn't, he would tell them again. He split his time between Hazelden, Miami, Florida. In fact, he was at Florida being visited by former Indiana Governor Harry Leslie when Harry Leslie suddenly died from heart failure while he was visiting George down there. They were friends, actually. Leslie and George were friends. In fact, I've got a postcard here on it that's signed by George, and then right up here it says Leslie. I went and checked because I've got a number of Leslie stuff. That's his signature. Okay. So they unfortunately in summer of 43 experienced a stroke that left him partially paralyzed, and in the next several months he had a series of small and major heart attacks, both which he then eventually lapsed into a coma, which he never recovered. He died May 16th, 1944 at Hazelden, Brook, Indiana. He's buried in Kentland. A Liberty ship was named for him at the tail end of World War II in September 44. The USS George Ade was torpedoed off the coast of North Carolina by a German U-boat. And but it didn't sink. It really has a much bigger story to it that if you want to, look into it, because it's actually kind of tragic. 2 Coast Guard cutters were sent out to rescue the USS George Ade. A hurricane swept in and destroyed the 2 cutters, and all crew on board were lost on the cutters. The George Ade crew survived. The ship remained floating. They were able to get back to tow it into harbor for repairs, and it stayed in service until 1967. After his death, George's papers, artifacts, and Hazelden property were transferred to Purdue University, but Purdue relinquished Hazelden to the state of Indiana when it could no longer keep up with the costs to keep the place up. The state then turned around and relinquished it to Newton County. Since that time, there's been a number of private groups that have tried to keep Hazelden up. They did succeed in placing it on the National Register of Historic Places in 1976. And efforts are still ongoing to raise funds to preserve and restore Hazelden. In fact, we've got a couple gentlemen here today like to have come up. Introduce yourselves, come on forward. These are folks that are associated with the current efforts that are going on with preserving Hazelden. So
That was a spectacular presentation. Really, always had the, a different perspective. By the way, Casperet's was also advertised as it'll really get you going. But I'm Mike Davis, and I'm on the George Ade Commission, and we are restoring the Hazelden estate. After George Ade died, he had left money for the medical clinic, which is the George Ade home, and it's nursing home now. And so what we've done in the last few years is changed it so that we're really making more prominent the Hazelden estate rather than George Ade home, to keep people from getting confused. And with that, we also look at it and say, like George said, there's so much history here, and the home itself was it was left into disrepair, and then in 1969 a group pulled together and redid the home, and then it was redone again in 1995, predominantly just as a museum. And so really that's the last major effort to preserve the home and the artifacts in it. But then with this oncoming commission that we have now, we're looking to make it relevant and sustainable. And so we really have a four-part program that we are working on. And pardon me. So we're looking at really four parts of it. One being we're taking this old carriage house and making that into a spot where we can have events, much like George loved to have, with 100 seats, a kitchen. And what that will do is allow us to redo the home itself and run it primarily as a museum. And then one of the things that people really enjoyed when they visited George Ade's home originally was the garden. And there was a garden that was in the south side of the building that was shaped in the state of Indiana. Ironically, the south end of the state was on the north end of the garden. And so that anyway, and we're going to keep it that way. And recreate that. And we worked with the Indiana Housing and Development Corporation and raised enough funds to redo that garden. And we should start that garden in this August and September. So really, and then the fourth part of it is to develop a tourism office within the home so that people know what's going on, not only in the Hazelden home, but also within the county, other items of interest. And so it's really kind of that four part thing that is being, we're taking, as a matter of fact, next week, we'll be taking part of the funding. We've been funded for the architectural and the landscape study. Eventually we'll get the whole thing funded through the county, and they've been very receptive thus far. So we're very excited about that. And that should happen hopefully within the next year to start that effort. And so then we'll be able to have home or tours of the home, as well as events such as graduation parties or wedding events and whatnot. So we're very excited about it. With that, we had an event to introduce the idea last year, and I brought some of these bags here that have some of the information I just talked about, and I would invite you all to take one home with you. The other thing I would like to do is that George's great nephew, Will Ade, has gone to an incredible amount of effort to develop a statue that's on the grounds of George Ade reading a book that was done by Jay Carpenter. And if you know that name, he's a very accomplished sculptor. And if you've ever seen the Kermit the Frog sculpture at the University of Maryland, that's the guy that did it as well. So it's really cool. And then Will developed a compilation of books or of plays called Plays Worth Remembering, which is the entire collection of George's play. And I wanted to present that to your association here. And those are on sale at the home, by the way. So anyway, thank you all for giving me this 2-minute shameless advertisement. Thank you.
Well, our final thing is, thanks, George, for sharing your talent, your creativity, and for holding a mirror up to us so we can see ourselves a little more humanity. And thanks for your attention again. We appreciate it. Programs.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention to those of you who are not members, and several of you are, if you're interested in receiving additional information about membership or upcoming programs, we do have a sign up kind of form up here, or you can use the QR code to do it online. Otherwise, our next program is actually this Thursday at 6 p.m. JC Allen. The photos are going to be explored by Fred Whitford. So that'll be an interesting program. I hope you'll join us again and have a great day.
What's the subject again Thursday?
JC Allen, the photographer.
JC Allen was a photographer who specialized or focused on the rural life in Tippecanoe County. And his photographs, if you see anything about Indiana in real life, in the 1930s, 1940s, even 1920s, it's a J.C. Allen photograph. He went on to actually he worked with for the Journal Courier, right? Also, or
I don't think so.
okay,
But,
okay.
but his home is the house on the our parking lot, this football stadium's parking lot, that house right there, that was his home right there.
Okay.
Purdue and that block.
All right. So he's got a really visual history of the area. Fred Whitford wrote a book not too long ago about rural Indiana with that, using many of those photographs. It's really fantastic book. So he's gonna be talking about that on
And
Thursday.
JC Allen's nephew, I believe.
Grandson.
Grandson, thank you. John will be here as well with some of the personal collection of JC Allen.
6 o'clock.
6 o'clock, Thursday, right here.
Very good. Well, thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Feedback.